我们之前都提到的这个罗奇到香港要寻求对话，那到底是谁和他展开了一番对话呀？那王辉耀到底和罗奇展开了怎样的一番？
这个对话是在北京进行的，
是在北京进行的。那这个应该是4月份的，这个中国经济发展
好像也是5月份吧
，5月份的，
对，那
是较早之前的一个罗奇和这个王耀，
上个星期好像就是上个星期
那就是稍早之前的这个，我们应该是一份实录，给大家重新展现罗奇怎么看待中国的这个经济走向，尤其是他怎么看待这个香港的未来那么依然要感谢为我们打赏的各位观众，感谢田贤，感谢麦团，感谢如是我闻，感谢各位观众的支持。那在下个礼拜，我们华尔街论坛再和大家不见不散。
大家好，欢迎收看华尔街电视，我是小安。你准备好去异国旅行放松心情了吗？亚洲如此的美丽，度假我们又该往哪里去呢？如何用最少的钱享受最大的旅行体验呢？这一期亚洲大眼睛就与您分享考爱。你是不是去了无数次的泰国旅行，但就只会去曼谷、芭提雅、苏梅岛之类的，对吧？其实泰国那么大，还有很多很漂亮的小地方是超级小众的，犹如世外桃源，重点是游客少，物廉价美，性价比高。这一期我们就一起来探索泰国考爱。由于地方有点多，这一期会分成上下集哦，赶紧点赞收藏，一起做攻略吧。考爱的天气常年都适合旅行，这里还可以看见流动的瀑布。考爱是泰国旅游中最独特的地区之一，而且它只距离曼谷短短3小时的车程而已哦。如果你有外国驾照的话，自驾游会更好哦。打车相对会比较没有那么容易。当然，你也可以选择乘坐巴士。曼谷 Mojet Bus Station 提供每半小时一辆开往 Pat Song 的巴士，巴士票价大约180泰铢。或者乘坐小巴，曼谷 Victory Monument 平均每2小时就有一辆开往 Pat Song 的小巴，每人收费大约180泰铢。你也可以乘坐火车，曼谷市中心路五郎汤火车站每天提供4班开往 Pat Song 的火车，车程介于4至5小时，车票大约是285泰铢起就有了。到了考爱，你一定会爱上这里满满的花田。小编推荐你21个你不可以错过的考爱旅行景点。1. Primo Piazza。Primo Piazza 完全就是小意大利的感觉，你会误以为自己身处在遥远的托斯卡尼村庄，置身在优雅的意大利式建筑而软石小路和文郁郁的大自然当中。Primo Piazza 在这里成功打造出舒适且温暖的地中海度假氛围，有成排的咖啡厅和餐厅，让你可以完全享受度假。有趣的是，你也可以在这里喂羊、羊驼、驴子等的可爱动物。2. 考爱酒庄 PP Valley。你知道吗？泰国也有自家酿的葡萄酒，重点是还很顺口。考爱酒庄是一个具有相当规模的酒庄，来到这里，你可以品尝到许多不同的酒类。但如果你不是美酒爱好者 ，PP Valley 也有提供自家的咖啡给人品尝。这里还可以到葡萄种植区及酒厂参观、打卡拍照哦。这里有经验的工作人员都会依你的品酒偏好，推荐不同的酒类给客人试喝。此外，这里也有不错的餐厅，快来这里感受一个不一样的泰国之旅吧。3. 考爱欧洲风情城堡，卖欧洲陶雅优，总称雅亚。这座富丽堂皇的度假村，除了散发出浓浓的欧式风情，也带有简朴的乡村气息。麦欧颂建立于2015年，这个新颖的酒店拥有干净宽敞的客房与美式乡村风格的家具，在酒店前也有碧绿的草坪，还有一个蛮大的高尔夫球场。如果你是高尔夫球爱好者，也可以在这里一试身手。4. 哈比人之家班树安度假村板树湾诺路，这里可是低配版1:1还原好莱坞电影《哈比人》的场景。重点是这里不仅仅是一个旅游景点，同时还是一个酒店，你可以直接在哈比人家里过夜，体验大巨人在小人国的生活。这里距离考爱国家公园只有几十分钟的车程，来到这里绝对会让你永生难忘。在这个度假村里，最棒的是莫过于有各式房间供游客选择居住，而且全是照着魔戒电影里的样子如实打造出来哦。5. 泰晤士之谷，这间独特的英式风格旅馆位于考爱，英国南方的迷人乡村景色，当地酒吧和河岸悠哉漫步，完全如实的在这里呈现给来访的客人，让每个人可以更容易一些体验到英式乡村的独特情怀。在这里生存的独特情怀，在这里甚至有一个花园迷宫，无论大人小孩都可在这里玩捉迷藏。 住宿方面，每间房间当然都是充满浓浓的英式乡村氛围，打造出朴实的感觉，让下榻住宿的游客们可以体验温暖氛围。有的住，当然也有的吃，这里可是有所谓的茶室 tea room， 品尝着优雅英式下午茶蛋糕3层塔，而来自新加坡的顶级茶沙龙的 TWGT 之后，再到城堡餐厅来个夜间烧烤活动。7. 萨拉五里向日葵田 Sarahbury Sunflower Field， 每年的11月到1月，向日葵田全部都要开花啦，无数多品种的向日葵争相开花，那画面实在无敌美的啦。平常经过花店，看到一朵向日葵，心情就会变好，更何况是一整个花田开花，可以亲眼见证这100朵齐放画面的人，根本超幸福的啦。如果是家族旅游的游客，非常推荐来海台湾哦，因为在这里不管是大人还是小孩都可以体验自己做冰淇淋。首先工作人员会先教导游客们一些农业的技术，之后就有工作坊的体验活动，让大家可以实际操作一遍哦。例如真正自己去体验挤牛奶啦，或是自己做一支牛奶冰淇淋。这里偶尔也会有牛仔表演秀哦。9. 考爱全景农场陶崖 Panorama Farm 集，这个农场全都是蘑菇，这里种了满满的蘑菇，而且可以学到观察到各式蔬菜的成长耕作过程。另外你也会拿到一些农场自种的蘑菇试吃，比较蘑菇间的差异，这里很推荐给蘑菇迷或是想要吃的健康的人来参观，让你可以学到健康，吃的健康，甚至玩的也健康。农场也有提供相当可爱的蘑菇小屋给游客住宿哦。10. 金汤普森农场尖塘普森方普森唐森，这里有一个巨大的南瓜。另外农场四周各自也种了不同的花田，也有规划可以让游客体验采收乐趣的地方，而且指定范围里的水果和蔬菜都任君采收，之后再依你采收的量做月收的费用，你就可以把蔬菜们通通带回家。如果在农场里走累了，也有游园火车可以搭乘猫，它会带着你环绕农场。另外也有不定时的舞蹈秀表演给游客看。11. 肯尼亚羊农场 Konya Sheep Farm， 这座热门的羊农场坐落在如画的泰国乡村，满满的羊群如白雪般点缀着，你还可以和羊群们拍照打卡，体验喂羊儿们啦。如果你想要来一杯斯文成熟的咖啡，细细欣赏美丽的羊群和自然景色，考爱好玩的地方真的太多了。重点是很多景点都还没被大力推广，所以游客不太多，大家赶紧去体验。记得先关注我们，下一期继续带您体验更多的考爱好去处。下集，大家好，我是来自6度世界的6博士，常驻6度简报的观察员。感谢大家收看这一期的华尔街电视。今天我们和大家一起探索了泰国考爱的几个独特景点，是不是已经心动了呢？从 Primo P.S 的小意大利风情到 P.B. 法利的葡萄酒庄，还有卖欧胜挑牙的欧式城堡风情，再到班卓诺的哈比人之家，考爱真的是一个美丽而多样的旅游胜地，尤其是那些喜欢自然风光和特色文化的朋友们，考爱绝对不会让你失望。考爱之所以吸引人，不仅仅是因为它的美景和风情，更因为这里的游客相对较少，物价也非常亲民，可以让你用最少的钱享受最大的旅行体验。特别推荐那些厌倦了大城市喧嚣的人们来这里放松身心，享受自然的宁静。当然，考爱的美景和特色远不止于此，下一期我们还会继续带你探索更多的考爱好去处。各位观众，赶紧点赞收藏，做攻略，准备好你的行李吧。好了，今天的节目就到这里。如果你对考爱有任何问题或想法，欢迎在评论区留言与我们互动。你有什么样的想法，期待与你们的交流。谢谢大家的收看，我们下期再见。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。中国的工厂在5月份出人意料地出现了萎缩，结束了连续2个月的增长势头，引发了人们对中国以出口为导向的经济复苏的质疑。这一次的回落令大部分的经济学家始料未及，但其实数月来已经有种种迹象表明，当前的增长速度难以为继。比如说，工厂产出远远超过新订单， 中国对出口的依赖日益增加。国家统计局周五表示，中国官方制造业采购经理人指数从4月份的 50.4 降至5月份的 49.5， 这使得这一指标跌回到50的临界线以下，代表制造业从扩张转变为萎缩。而《华尔街日报》之前采访的大部分经济学家都以为中国5月份的经济增长可以达到 50.4， 但结果远低于预期。值得注意的是，其中新出口订单大幅下降，这需要引起警惕，因为北京已经加倍投入高端制造和出口，用来抵消中国房地产行业的崩溃。经济学家张志伟表示，中国不能只依赖出口来推动经济发展，财政政策需要更加积极主动，以刺激内需。拖累中国出口的原因之一，可能是近几个月来美国消费者信心和支出的明显转变，因为美国仍然是中国最大的出口市场。密歇根大学的一项长期调查显示，5月份美国消费者信心跌至去年11月以来的最低水平。4月份美国零售额已经开始持平，就业增长大幅回落。从历史上看，中国新出口订单的总体趋势往往与美国消费者信心保持一致。这表明，尽管中国最近向俄罗斯和其他新兴市场倾斜，但是美国消费者对中国仍然至关重要。在2023年底的大部分时间里，产出的增长速度都远远超过新订单的增长速度，4月份也是如此。这给商品价格和利润进一步带来了下行压力，并且表明工厂的增长超过了实际需求。周五公布的最新数据中也有一些好消息，虽然中小企业举步维艰，但是大型制造商仍然在努力扩张。火车和飞机等运输设备、计算机和通讯设备的制造商连续第3个月实现了扩张。专家认为，这可能表明北京在过去半年推出的一系列旧设备的以旧换新政策起到了一定的作用。中国服务业 PMI 也从4月份的 50.3 小幅上升至 50.5， 但是建筑业 PMI 从 56.3 降至 54.4， 是2月份以来的最低点。此前，由于中国第一季度经济增长好于预期，再加上前不久北京出台了新措施提振房地产市场，允许国有企业购买没有售出的住房，媒体将这次视称为历史性的政策转变。因此，许多机构最近上调了对中国经济增长的预测。本周，国际货币基金组织就将今年中国经济增长预期从 4.6% 上调至了 5.0%， 与北京设定的目标一致。然而，最新一轮数据不佳，尤其是如果6月份的数据持续不佳的话，那么将给北京带来更大的压力，迫使习近平需要更加积极地解决房地产行业的问题。因为中国共产党将于7月份召开3中全会，届时将可能会有重大政策变化。而同时，由于北京现在决心通过增加出口来促进经济增长，它可能倾向于贬值人民币，尤其是最近人民币对其他亚洲货币的汇率有所升值。金融时报报道，有一些对冲基金正在积极压注人民币在今年晚些时候将会贬值。金融时报指出，如果真是这样，预计会出现严重的连锁反应。一位上海的货币交易员表示，由于过去几个月积累的巨大下行压力，大量交易员预计人民币将会出现一次性贬值，类似于2015年的情况。在2015年，中国突然让人民币贬值，认为人民币估值过高，这引发了当时金融市场的动荡，包括全球基金经理大举抛售人民币，严重的资本外流，以及中国外汇储备减少了1万亿元人民币。监管机构后来出手干预，试图平息市场。中国央行不愿意让汇率快速波动，而是倾向于保持稳定。今年年初，习近平将强势货币作为首要任务之一，也是加强中国金融强国地位的一部分。人民币贬值将会对全球贸易产生巨大影响，可能会加剧与华盛顿之间的紧张关系，因为这将提高中国对美国出口的竞争力。西方经济体，尤其是美国的高利率，最近导致其他亚洲货币对美元进一步大幅下跌。今年以来，人民币对美元汇率已经下跌了约 2%， 日元则下跌了 11% 以上，韩元下跌 5% 以上。日韩都是中国的贸易竞争对手。中金公司研究部的首席离岸策略师刘凯文表示，如果中国在增加中央政府投资来提振经济增长的同时去贬值人民币，这将发出混合信号。他表示，最近发行的长期债券应该会为人民币提供积极的催化剂。还有业内人士认为，从简单的贸易角度来看， 人民币并没有被高估。只要中国出口增长强劲，在这种情况下，人民币对美元通常会升值。本周三，人民币对美元汇率已经跌至6个月来的最低点 7.2487。有报道称，中国国有银行正在悄悄购买人民币，以阻止人民币进一步的贬值。到目前为止，北京似乎还不愿意让人民币进一步贬值。一位政府官员告诉《金融时报》的记者，北京可能之后会让人民币贬值，但是他们不希望市场受到冲击。《金融时报》报道，人民币和日元接下来的走势值得关注，因为预计今年货币动荡有引发市场动荡的风险，并且这种风险在不断上升。不要因为过去10年主要货币市场一直很平静，就认为这种情况会一直持续下去。全球经济的紧张局势正在加剧，无论是在亚洲还是在其他任何地方，而这些紧张局势都难以轻易解决。以上就是今天新风视线的全部内容，感谢您的收看。这里是华尔街电视，如果喜欢记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道，我们下期节目再见。
Try to stimulate some thinking on China, its role in the world economy. The conventional wisdom is that China is the world's most powerful engine of economic growth. And I think that has been true for a number of years, but I think we need to rethink that dynamic between China and the world in China. My thesis that I want to just lay out for you today with the support of a few slides that I've brought with me is that the engine, the Chinese global growth engine, is not as powerful as it used to be. There are some new sources of global growth that are evident, but even they are not enough to give the world the same type of support that we have become accustomed to. And the U.S.-China conflict, which is an ongoing subject of my own writing and research, represents probably the single greatest threat to the overall global growth dynamic in the years ahead. So how do we get my slides up there? Okay. So this is a busy slide, but it shows you a couple of things. One, the IMF's latest projections of global growth through the year 2029. And two, a couple of horizontal lines, one drawn at 3.5%, the black line on the top, which represents the trend rate of growth in the world economy since 1960. And then the red line at 2.5%, below which the world is normally considered to be in a global recession. The forecast looks okay between now and 2029, but it's most importantly below trend. And when the world is growing below trend, it lacks the cushion that is normally required to deal with shocks should they occur. And that leaves the world vulnerable to the onset of a new recession. The China outlook is a very different outlook than we are accustomed to in examining your long, dynamic, and major source of global growth. On the left, the solid black line is the 5-year trend in Chinese GDP growth. And it's moving steadily lower and projected to do so between now and 2029. The peak 5-year growth rate was 11.7% in the year 2007. And by the end of the forecast period, that number is projected to be 3.8%. That is a dramatic slowdown by any account that you can think of. And the slowdown can be broken down into short-term or cyclical pressures, such as the property crisis, or longer-term structural issues that I will talk about shortly that have to do with demography, total factor productivity, and geostrategic conflict with the United States. The property problem is China's major cyclical growth impediment in my view. And the government has just announced a new property support package. In my humble opinion, it's a step in the right direction, but it is not nearly large enough to absorb the excess inventory on the supply side of your housing market. The lending support package of the PBOC isn't adequate to take up the outsized inventory of housing stock that is now overhanging the supply side of the Chinese property market. At Yale, I've taught 2 courses over the years that bear on this issue. One is a big class on the Chinese economy, and a second seminar is on the lessons of Japan. And if you study the lessons of Japan carefully, you will note that the property crisis, which lasted for 18.5 years in Japan, was a major impediment to the recovery of the Japanese economy in the aftermath of the lost decades of the 1990s and early 2000s. And by many measures, the property problems in China are every bit as large as those which we saw in Japan, and we are only in the very early stages of addressing that problem. It took 19 years to address the Japanese property problems. The structural issues in China are also, surprisingly, quite Japanese-like. I show you 2 major structural issues that are now afflicting the Chinese economy: the aging of the population. The working age population, of course, peaked in the year 2015, and the recent decline in total factor productivity. In my lectures on Japan, I have the same confluence of structural problems that I can show you, but I'm not going to show them to you today in the interest of time. I want to assure you the chart looks identical. The only difference is it took place 20 years earlier in Japan. The way we do economics from a growth accounting point of view is when a nation is faced with a demographic problem of an aging population, the only way you can maintain rapid economic growth is to offset the demographic headwinds through increased productivity growth. Japan was unable to do that, and I worry about China's capacity to do that as well. TFP, as you see, has been declining actually since the year 2011, in large part reflecting the fact that much of Chinese economic activity is now taking place in low productivity SOEs, and the private sector, which has historically been a strong source of productivity growth in China, is now feeling the pressures of regulatory restraints, especially in the internet platform area. So these two conditions make China sort of a worrisome parallel of what we saw in Japan, where the headwinds from an aging population will not be offset by an increase in productivity of those that are still on the job. So, you know, this is a long chart here. I'm not saying that China is the next Japan, but there are clearly some worrisome parallels as seen from the standpoint of asset bubbles, debt intensity, the incidence of corporate zombies, the aging, the demography, and of course, conflict with the U.S. Japan was in conflict with the U.S. on trade policy in the late 80s, and now it's China. The U.S. always needs to blame somebody for its growth problems, and we like blaming large Asian nations. One other thing about the Japan comparison that I will leave you with, and then move on to the topic at hand, the global growth dynamic, is the notion of the Chinese growth shock itself. On the surface, it doesn't seem to be a big deal. I mean, you can see what happened in Japan, 45 years, the green bar on the left, of 7.25% growth, and followed by 45 years of less than 1% growth. China has slowed, but in no way is that slowing as severe as that which is evident has been evident in Japan. But it is all relative. And what you see on the right is the difference between the growth comparisons in the high growth period, Japan and China, versus that which has occurred recently in Japan and that which is projected to occur over the next 5 years in China. If you take that IMF forecast as an accurate projection of what is to come, and you can argue against that, the deceleration of Chinese economic growth plotted on the right is almost identical to that which has happened in Japan since 1991. That's a growth shock, whether you want to admit it or not. And when there's a growth shock, you know, that sort of changes everything. The idea that you can count on rapid growth as the rising tide that sort of masks all underlying problems, that gets drawn into serious question. And if the IMF forecast is correct on looking out over the next 5 years of China, maybe you're more optimistic than that, so it's less of a concern, but I'm not, then the possibility of a Chinese growth shock being comparable to that experienced in Japan is something you need to take very seriously. So what's all that mean to world economic growth? This graph measures the cumulative contribution of China to global growth. And you can see something very interesting about this, and that bar, the second bar from the left, shows the Chinese growth contribution at its maximum, close to 33% from, wait, I just gotta, sorry. from 2010 to 2019. No, that's, yeah, maybe I'll do that, yeah. Thank you. From 2010 to 2019. Then came COVID, and post-COVID, the Chinese contribution to global growth has slowed dramatically. The 32 went down to about 24, and again, on the basis of the IMF's forecast, it's going to drop further to about 21% over the 3 years, to 2027 to 2029. And so China is still the most powerful engine in the world, but the power of the engine is diminishing. And the idea that, you know, we're talking about China as being, in and of itself, enough to account for over 30% of global growth, that needs to be rethought. Who's filling the void? Well, India is trying, and you know, if you look around the world for new sources of global growth, you can see that the Indian source, which was, you know, 1/3 of that of China's in the 2010 to 2019 interval, when China's impetus to global growth was at its maximum, that Indian source is almost doubling by 2027 to 2029, when the Chinese growth contribution is slowing. I'm optimistic on India. I'm not as, historically, I have not been as optimistic on India as I have been on China, but there's a lot of attention being given to India right now as a new source of global growth, and it's something we need to look at very carefully in the years ahead. The rest of the world, I'm afraid to say, doesn't really matter. I mean, you look at the U.S. share, it's been roughly stable at around accounting for 10% of global growth for a long period of time. I'm sorry, I know we have an ambassador here from Europe, but Europe is even less consequential in making a contribution to global growth than the United States. And then if you look elsewhere in the world, Japan, ASEAN, Latin America, Middle East, I mean, they barely show up on the chart. So if you're looking at the global growth dynamic, recently, currently, and prospectively, China, U.S., and India, those are the three sources that will matter the most. And I've stressed here this afternoon that the Chinese growth engine is not going to be what it used to be. The final thing I want to talk to you about, though, is the impact of conflict, especially U.S.-China conflict, on the global growth dynamic. This is a worrisome development and potentially a big deal. For the Chinese economy itself, the export share of the Chinese economy has come down dramatically from its peak in 2007, but it's you know, on the rise recently. And Xi Jinping, in his latest policy pronouncements, is placing major emphasis on manufacturing-led, export-led growth in China, especially in the advanced technology and in the capital goods area. The U.S., at the same time, has resisted Chinese export growth, and thanks to former President Trump, who, as you know, was convicted of 34 felony charges today in New York, we are in the midst of a major trade war with China that was sparked by President Trump, but continued under the Biden administration. These are U.S. tariffs on Chinese products, which were virtually nothing, and they're still holding at about 19.3% of overall imports from China today. And China, of course, has reciprocated, and that has had a significant impact on Chinese demand for U.S.-made goods. The Biden administration has, as I said, continued to prosecute Donald Trump's trade war. And I find this, I'm trying to be fair. I'm not being either supportive of a Republican or a Democrat. I'm critical of both. When President Biden took office on January 20th, 2021, he signed 17 executive orders that unwound some of the most unpopular acts of the Trump administration. The trade wall, the border wall with Mexico, the travel ban on Muslims, U.S. Getting out of the Paris Agreement on climate change, the World Health Organization. He reversed all of that, but he did not unwind Trump's tariffs. And a few weeks ago, he announced a further expansion of tariffs under this provision of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974, known as Section 301. And the most worrisome aspect of those tariffs, I think, were in these areas involving Chinese production of alternative energy products, batteries, electric vehicles, and solar cells. There's a number of other items that are the tariffs are increasing. The point's been made, don't worry about electric vehicles. The tariffs are going to 100%, but the U.S. doesn't buy too many cars, electric cars made in China, at least not yet. I think this is a huge strategic mistake driven by election year politics in the United States. The world is in the grips of a horrific climate problem, desperately in need of new solutions through alternative non-carbon fueled energy products. To take a protectionist stand against a country like China that has a comparative advantage in producing the non-carbon alternative energy products that a world in the grips of climate change desperately needs is a blunder potentially of historic proportions, in my view. It is precisely the wrong thing at the wrong time, and an example of how poisonous politics can be in shaping trade policy for the world's leading nation. President Biden has made a big deal about ending America's, what he called forever wars. That was the rationale that he used for getting out of Afghanistan in the summer of 2021. I worry that he is getting himself even deeper into a new forever war against Chinese trading practices. The U.S. continues to make the same mistake on trade policy today that it made with Japan, and that is putting pressure on one nation at a time when it really faces a trade balance that's made up of many, many nations. We call it a multilateral trade balance. You can't fix a multilateral problem by putting bilateral pressure on one of your trading partners. We have a multilateral trading problem because we have big budget deficits that depress our domestic saving. When economies don't save and they want to grow, they import surplus savings from abroad. They run massive current account and trade deficits with many, many nations to attract the foreign capital. And so what has happened in the United States is we've done to China what we did to Japan in the late 80s. We've reduced the Chinese share of our trade deficit, just like we reduced the Japanese share. The Chinese share of our trade deficit has gone down sharply from a peak of about 50% in 2015 to about 21% last year. But our budget deficit's gotten bigger. Our domestic saving has gotten lower. And so the result is all we've done is we've diverted trade away from China toward other nations that have picked up the slack. And those nations are listed right here: Mexico, Vietnam, Canada, South Korea, Taiwan, India, Ireland, and Germany. And if you decompose their share of U.S. imports, 70% of that collection of nations are higher cost producers than the U.S. So our trade policies are actually imposing the functional equivalent of tax hikes on American workers. Again, an example of the poisonous impact of politics on trade policy. We did it with Japan. We're doing it again with China. And that gets me back to where I started with, and that is the global economic outlook. I showed you in that first slide that global growth doesn't really have the cushion that it would need to withstand the pressures of an unexpected shock. What this slide shows you is that we've had a shock in the global economy. The list is too long to go through, but basically every 2 to 3 years. And given the mounting pressures on the U.S.-China trade front, you cannot rule out the possibility of another shock in the next year or so. Markets are not priced for that. That's what this chart on the right shows. And the global economic outlook, this is a forward-looking forecast of world economic growth. It's the weakest that it's been since the early 1990s. And so the possibility of an unpleasant surprise in global growth cannot be ruled out in light of this mounting conflict between the United States and China. And Henry mentioned a book I wrote a number of years ago. What he didn't mention was a book I wrote last year that can be ordered on Amazon right now as you're sitting there. It's called Accidental Conflict, and it focuses on the risks, the mounting risks of conflict between the United States and China in light of the Trump tariff wars that have been prosecuted further by President Joe Biden, and makes the case that unless something major is done to bring our nations together, and Henry mentioned my proposal for establishing a U.S.-China Secretariat, which I continue to be very much in favor of, that the possibilities of accidental conflict are something to take very seriously. And with pressures building to this very day in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, the new tariffs that President Biden is imposing on China, this is something to take very seriously and something that we must stand up and say no to today if we are serious about defending the strength and resilience of the global economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, for your excellent presentation. I think it's really very helpful for all of us to have a better understanding of what's going on. And I think you outlined the global growth and what China's contribution can be and continue to be challenges, opportunities. But also, you talk about the experience of other nations like Japan, India. And then you talk about, continuously what are the problems that we're having now. So this is great. I mean, this is very good, overview. And now we want to get into a dialogue section. And I would like to, ask you some questions. First, you mentioned about this IMF forecast. I think that was very interesting. Because IMF actually recently they mentioned that projected growth for 2024 will be 5%, right? Up from 4.5%. Actually, I know 4.5% in 2025. So they actually increased their projection by 0.4%, and so this is interesting, But also you mentioned, of course, the trend is coming down, and so the question I would like to ask is that, of course, China, with magnitude, with the size of its economy and such a big second largest economy, they cannot, when the bases are low, they have a lot of a big percentage. But even now today, even 5% or 4.5%. Probably equal to 10% 10 years ago, or 15% 20 years ago. So every year there's a large equivalent of, I don't know if it's Australia or Indonesia GDP added to China, and also the other thing is they are now from high speed growth to high quality, and for example, I remember many years ago they were talking about 700 million shares to exchange for 1.747. Now China become the largest automobile exporter in the world. So there's a lot of quality changes. How do you interpret that? Even though the speed may come down, but the quality may pick up, and that is still needed. And then how we can really continue that kind of from high speed to high quality, and what are the things we still need to be cautious of, and how we can really continue that. Positive momentum, even though we are not achieving the high speed we used to have.
Well, you touch on a few things, Henry. One, the IMF's forecast revision. Half a point, in the way that forecasting accuracy goes these days, it's an upward revision, but it doesn't change the basic story of an economy that is still growing at best about half the pace that it did in the high growth era when the Chinese economy grew 10% for 31 years from 1980 to 2011. You're right that as the base gets bigger, smaller increments mean more, but my point on the growth shock that I tried to end with is that this has been abrupt. The slowdown has been concentrated in the last few years, and when China was growing rapidly for much, much longer than anybody thought, the expectations were built in that China and the world could count on rapid growth, irrespective of the base effects going forward. And this notion that the leadership continues to boast about in addressing global forums like the China Development Forum and I heard Premier Li say this at the China Development Forum at the end of March, that China accounts for, I think the number he used was 35% of global growth. That's out of date. That number is no longer accurate, and it's going to get smaller. Your final point, though, is, I think, the most important, and that is moving away from a focus on the quantity to the quality of growth. I've had the privilege and the opportunity of making speeches in this country for, every year of the last quarter century, and I've always pounded the table on precisely that, shifting from a fixation on quantity to improved quality of economic growth. How do we measure the quality of economic growth? You can measure it through environmental metrics, and I was delighted to wake up this morning and drive across town and see a beautiful blue sky in Beijing, and I think there has been some improvement in air quality in China over the last, 10 years. My favorite scientific metric for quality, though, is total factor productivity. And the trend there is worrisome. From the 2011 to 2019 period, a 10-year period, TFP growth, as we call it, has been dropping by a little over 1% a year. And that follows a big upsurge in the prior 15 years. And that is a worrisome sign of deteriorating quality of Chinese economic growth because it raises questions about the efficiency of labor and capital in generating sustained growth in overall economic output. You cannot have high quality growth with weak TFP. And a final metric to think about, and it gets a lot of discussion in China, is measures of the equality or inequality of the income distribution. And, the conclusion is pretty straightforward based on most metrics that China, and China's not alone in this respect, certainly has problems with mounting income inequality as well.
Thank you, Steve. Excellent point. I think absolutely. I think we need to address all those inequality and that common prosperity. That is really China. The better life of the people is really the target of government to strive for. And while maintaining high quality, we have to maintain equality. So that's really a good point. But I'd like to also touch upon the other issue you raised. You talk about Japan, you talk about the aging population, and then whether China going to repeat what Japan has gone through, and also what are the impetus, what are the next drive for the Chinese economy. The real estate market is also mentioned that it's slowing down. And so what are the next biggest transformative policy that the government can propose? So here I'd like to discuss a bit of our thinking with you. Is that, for example, we have the third planning of the 20th Party Congress is going to have in July. We are expecting a lot of new policies. We are thinking. You talk about real estate. Premier Li mentioned at the China Development Forum in March this year that urbanization of 300 million migrant workers would be probably the big next drive. So I'm thinking, how we can translate that into a concrete policy in addition to trade-in and other policies. I'm thinking of, for example, in the last 45 years of China opening up, there's every 10 years, there's always a revolutionary policy that drive up the process. For example, in the 80s, the government had a policy of contract the land for the farmers to grow whatever they like, to break away of a planned economy. And we changed the Chinese society from a society of a shortage to a society of abundance. So that policy has really changed China dramatically. And then second decade policy was that government realized, the real estate market in the cities, why can't we allocate the flats for the workers and the citizens, urban residents in the cities? Privatize that almost, very minimum cost. And so everybody in the city has an apartment or buy apartment that actually cultivated the 400 million middle class. And then in the year of 2000 afterwards, China joined WTO. It's another revolutionary policy where they have, there's a handful of SOE does the trade, did the trade, but now, 6 million companies can conduct foreign trade, and China become the largest trading nation in the world. So for the last 10, 15 years, we are thinking, where are the next low-hanging fruit revolutionary policy that we can tap into? So Premier Lee's actually, his comment at the China Development Forum stimulated me to think. We are now have urbanization, you also mentioned in your presentation, about, Japan, other countries, 80%, or Western country, US. China is only 66%, according to the Premier Lee. But only 50% has the hukou and city resident benefit. The other 16 does not have it. So we talk about 300 million migrant workers living in the city, but they are not enjoying the city rights. So the reason for that is they have a household land in the rural area. So the rural area household land is empty with seniors and youngsters, but also they are renting a big, lot of apartments in the city. So there's a lot of redundancy and waste. So I'm thinking, if we can really, like in the 90s, privatize the apartment for the workers, can we, allow the farmers who are already settled in the city to sell their household land in the rural area, and so that they can get first startup capital to buy the real estate second-hand down payment in the cities, and avoid this 9 billion people travel around during the Chinese New Year visiting each other, and also to make social justice. So would that be a low-hanging hand for the biggest policy that we can hope for? And I would like to hear your comments on that. Thank you, Steve.
I think it's a great idea, Henry. I like your thinking. I would like to broaden it out, though, because you introduced this by saying every 10 to 15 years, there's a big change that injects new energy, a new source of growth into China. And I have been pounding the table for longer than I care to remember about the need for a new impetus to household sector private consumption in China. The numbers are very clear. The latest share of Chinese GDP going to private household consumption is below 38%. 38%, that's ridiculously low. Now, your proposal goes right to one aspect of that, and that is to the 300 million migrant workers who clearly have the potential to be tapped as a new source of consumption. I would say that is necessary but not sufficient. So I'm endorsing you. But I would say of equal significance would be the need to really inject much more funding and vitality into the social safety net, healthcare and retirement, because I think that is the biggest impediment to discretionary consumption, because it keeps families who are aging rapidly predisposed toward precautionary saving in providing for the future. And to the extent that a non-significant portion of those families lack hukou because of their residency preference, that would be additive to that problem. So I would combine the two into a much broader program aimed at injecting new stimulus into private household consumption in China. I think it's a good idea, but it's not enough on its own. Just say one other thing about the current Chinese policy strategy. Like you, I was also at the China Development Forum and heard Premier Li address policy priorities for China. And he repeated a theme that he had emphasized in his work report a month earlier to the National People's Congress, saying that the real priority, the most important priority, is focusing on new productive forces aimed at boosting manufacturing and, in particular, a new round of export-led growth in China. He mentioned, in addition to that, the need to stimulate domestic demand along the lines of what you and I have been talking about. The first priority, though, is one that is clearly causing a lot of negative reaction in the U.S., increasingly in the G7, and it's all wrapped up in this excess capacity debate that I alluded to in my own comments. So, this twofold strategy is important for China, but it creates conflicts that I think are also problematic in shaping the growth outlook in this country.
Great, thank you, Steve. Absolutely, I agree. You mentioned that we should really have new, a strong impetus or stimulus or revolutionary policy that badly needed, not by China, but also for the world. I think real estate is one of the biggest factors because in the Chinese traditional thinking, if you have a piece of asset, then you are confident you're going to spend more. You're not going to take the wallet close to your chest and then withhold from spending. So I think stabilize the real estate market is crucial. And actually in China, I read somewhere there's an apartment built enough to house 200 million people. So 300 million migrant workers, if we move them to the cities and let them have a legitimate identity to live in the cities, they're going to contribute to the stability of China. Now, I'd like to ask you another question. You mentioned about just now new productive courses, new quality productive forces. Interesting, you also mentioned the tension on those tariffs. President Biden raised on the EV cars, batteries, and the solar, all those new green energy technology and products. Actually, according to the International Atomic Agency, in order to combat climate change, according to the Paris Accord, we probably need more, like at least 800 gigawatts of new green power to combat. And now we can only produce a quarter of that. And then the world needs to spend $4.5 trillion a year on the green spending. The world is only spending 1.8 trillion, far from oversupply. So I was even reading that the European government is considering to extend their, phasing out of the diesel gasoline-driven car. Originally it said by 2035, now it's extend to 2040 because they want to extend the life of diesel and the gasoline car. So if we are having a changing climate so badly, and it's really strange to see that U.S. and even sometimes Western countries are so calling for more products, more technology available to combat the climate change. Now China has developed that. Now they're refusing to have it, and they even put tariff on that. And 90% of the commercial flights is supplied by Boeing and Airbus. We don't see it's overcapacity. So I just want to get your opinion from non-Chinese. What do you think about, we are urgently need green products in this world. And China, after so many years of experiment, hard working and trial, and of course with opening up of help of every country, now to have this product available, now the country says, no, you are overcapacity. So what do you think? What's your take on this question?
I think it borders on insanity. In a world that is facing unmistakable signs of climate change, there is no such thing as excess capacity in non-carbon green energy products. If anything, there is a shortage of alternative energy products. China is providing an enormous service and a benefit to the world in producing low-cost, clean energy products that the world desperately needs to protect itself against the ravages of climate change. China has the technology, the scale, and therefore, by definition, the comparative advantage in delivering exactly what a climate-torn world needs. And we resist this purely for political pressures because we have this desire led by the United States to contain Chinese economic growth and development. We also have, as you have in China, national security concerns. I can think of no greater threat to national security than destabilizing the world's climate. And so if we're serious about looking at national security, or from the standpoint of the security of our planet, we need to be, I think, much more appreciative of the need to allow nations that have comparative advantage in giving the world what it needs support rather than resistance.
Thank you for your very good views that look at this issue. So I appreciate that. And absolutely, the world is is really burning. We need to really work together. Also, in you mentioned about the book you have. This would be my last question. I would like to open it up, but I'd like to ask you this question before I do so. You mentioned about the book, Accidental Conflict, American, China, and the Clash of False Narratives, which is exactly right on, because you gave me that book last year. I read it. I found it very fascinating. The perception of both countries, China and the West, and the U.S., and then, of course, the narratives are totally different. And so how can we really get more right narratives, of course? I mean, you talk about, for example, national security. There's too much emphasis on the national security now. There's driving up, all those things. But equally important, even more important, climate security. Food security, energy security, environment security, and
health security.
Health security, absolutely. The benefiting of the mind, human security. We recently had just a big symposium in Washington talk about human security. So I think those are really important. So how can we really gradually have the right narrative and have a global governance for those common concerns? Rather than we develop into two camps, there's more security alliance built up, but on the other hand, China is doing a lot of economic alliance for the globalization. So how can we really converge that? And then maybe, China and the U.S. has a moral responsibility for the mind conflict, the human security. So exactly, I like the idea of a secretary office of a secretary for the China-U.S. relation be right on.
Well, let me just give you my theory behind your important question, Henry. When I started working on this book 4 or 5 years ago, I started out with some of the ideas that I summarized in the slides today, and that is that we have, in the United States, many false impressions about China. And then as I did the research, I said, wait a second. There's a number of false impressions that China has about the United States as well. And the reason that both nations have false impressions or false narratives about each other, and they have such important impacts on the policy actions that we take toward one another, is because of politics. We let political pressures drive wrong directional policies, in my view. That's true of trade policy in the U.S., and it's true of China's concerns about America's threat to its national sovereignty. So what I end the book on is recognizing that the politically driven process of engagement that both nations have embraced since the early 1970s is more driven by politicians than by technocrats. And politicians tend to operate on the basis of appealing to workers or promising their citizens a better life, and they get us into trouble. So my proposal is for a new organization that I call a U.S.-China Secretariat that really changes the architecture of engagement between the two superpowers, takes it out of the hands of the politicians, the leaders who are driven by their own personal political agendas. With all due respect, you have that same problem that we do, and puts it in the hands of technocrats who have a broad remit to deal with all aspects of the relationship, not just when the leaders meet once a year, but 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they deal with trade, economics, innovation policy, technology transfer, industrial policies, subsidies of state-owned enterprises, the big existential issues like health, cyber, climate. It's an organization that is built around a collaborative model of research based on a common, mutually agreed upon database. It's an organization that collectively works on the oversight and compliance of existing bilateral agreements. And should disputes arise, it screens disputes and has a built-in dispute resolution mechanism. We need a new architecture of engagement. The current structure is creating conflict as opposed to conflict resolution. And if we don't get serious about addressing our mutual issues, we will not have conflict resolution. We'll continue to have conflict escalation, and that is the biggest risk of accidental conflict. We've got to change it.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That's absolutely crucial. I'm all for this proposal. You know, China-U.S. should really have a close working team. And also, you mentioned about the policy on both sides. Absolutely, I think, you know, we see this the U.S. of course because of globalization affecting many working class. And then, but the real estate, the Wall Street is really making, hitting all-time high. And the 1% of Wall Street is equal to the 40-50% of the mass population in the U.S. And then the gap is big. There's a lot of social injustice. But then we cannot really have that all blamed on China because, the business is making all the
Politicians need someone to blame.
That's right.
That's why, again, I'm not in favor of a political solution to the type of superpower conflict that we have.
Absolutely. So I think on that note, I think we'll finish our dialogue. But I think I totally agree. We should increase dialogue, mutual exchanges, and of course, and create a new narrative of the China and the U.S. had a huge responsibility for the human security and for the future to come. So now I'll open for the question. I know the China Daily report is here. Is that right? And also I have a Beijing Daily and China Information Center and Global People Magazine. So anybody wants to start? Okay, we have this. We have this. There's three in a row. Okay, there's. Okay, from backwards is fine.
First of all, my name is Yisun Zheng. I'm a reporter from the Global People Magazine. So I hope to thank CTG for organizing this event. I have two questions, if it's okay. So my first question is, so we actually had an interview with Professor Roach about 11 years ago. And back then, like Professor Roach said, he's a long-term optimist of the Chinese economy. So I'm wondering, is right now, are you still believe this? So, and my second question is about the Sino-American relations. So, Professor Roach and Ms. Wang discussed like there are certain false impression of China and the U.S. have on each other. But what we see is, when facing economic difficulties, China have a greater consensus on thinking like the cooperation with the U.S. will be a solution of the economic stagnation. When the U.S. politicians tend to believe the relationship with China is a threat to their economic development. So I think this is a great difference. So like in this situation, do you both think, in your both perspective, do you think the current trade dispute between China demonstrated a long-term trend in the U.S. foreign policy towards China, or it is more like a short-term policy? It is just a symptom that the U.S. politician is trying to adjust to a new reality of the bilateral relationship between China and the U.S. Thank you.
Yeah, those are good questions. Let me deal, first of all, with my own view. If I met you 11 years ago and I said I was optimistic over the long term, 11 years is a long term. So, I stayed optimistic probably for 10 of those 11 years. That's a long time, right? I think, more seriously, my outlook is certainly more cautious today than it was back then, and in fact more cautious right now with respect to China going forward than it has been at any point in the 25 years I've been actively involved in your following your economy, both living here and from abroad. And I've changed my view in the last year or so, in large part for the reasons I mentioned in my presentation. The demographic changes are happening much more quickly than we thought. The UN demographic projections as recently as 2 to 3 years ago called for Chinese population to peak in 2031. It happened in 2021, 10 years earlier. And number two, the TFP issue total factor productivity. The trends have been weak, and they're an outgrowth of conscious policy choices that the Chinese government has made, not only to throw more support behind low productivity SOEs, but to put tighter regulations on higher productivity private sector, especially internet platform companies. And the third and final consideration in my shift has to do with my deep-rooted concerns about the U.S.-China conflict, which have really gone from bad to worse over the last few years, which gets me to your second question on the conflict itself. There are different perceptions on both sides of the relationship about the role that each nation can play in supporting or in constraining each other's prosperity. You're entirely correct. The Washington view is that China is a threat to long-term prosperity. China has not had that view about the United States until, I would say, the last year. It was a year ago at the National People's Congress in early 2023 when President Xi underscored for the first time his concern that U.S.-China policies were now posing the long-term threat of suppression all around the containment of China's growth and development objectives. And this represents a shift in his point of view as well. And so both of these perceptions, they come from different places, but they end with the same emphasis on mutually shared perceptions of conflict, which I think are worrisome for the long-term stability of our economic and political relationships. There's still, I think, good spirit on a people-to-people basis, but even that over time, I think, becomes adversely affected if the economic and political and trade and technology conflict continues to deepen.
Yeah, no, I had maybe add a little bit on that. Is that I feel that China's economy, as you mentioned, the aging population, demographic changes, and all those things. But on the other hand, there's more synergy now. You have the best infrastructure in the world. You have 70% of the 5G networks. You have a 12 million freshly graduate single-child, well-educated talent pool, and of course you have all the 1.1 billion smartphone users. So there's a lot of productivity. For example, China already become a cashless society, and then the productivity is at all-time high, probably in terms of certain areas. So I'm not that pessimistic, but I think things could change. As for China-U.S. relation, of course, President Xi also mentioned you have 1,000 reasons to be in good relations, not a single reason to be in bad relation. I think China was responding more to the U.S. hostile policy, but still, we want to maintain good relations. President Xi even invited 50,000 American young people to come to China. So let's hope for the best. The second, the gentleman from Bloomberg, I suppose, yeah.
Hi, I'm James from Bloomberg. I have a question about overcapacity, but I wanted to sort of step away from the three news or the new energy products you were talking about and look more broadly at the economy. If you look at steel production, or if you look at all the things that go into housing, production is still the same level as it was before the Three Red Lines policy was brought in. We're looking at 1 billion tons of steel being produced this year, but demand for that domestically is nowhere near where it was, and so that's being exported. And so March steel exports are at a record. You're seeing petrochemical exports for plastics and also other things. Also, things that can't be used in housing anymore in China are being exported. But if you think about the green transition and the decarbonization, excess steel capacity and excess steel production is one of the steel production is a big driver of carbon emissions. So it would seem that China is exporting these products because it continues to produce domestically, even though there really isn't a need for it to even be making these products in the first place. And then making those products is leading to greater carbon emissions. So sort of thinking about the overcapacity question more broadly than just batteries and EVs and solar panels, do you think that there needs to be more done in China to deal with the capacity issues that are being seen in the industrial economy? And my second question is on the tariffs that the US has put in place specifically. The argument of the USTR and the government is that they're providing space for domestic industry and for foreign investment to build those same sectors in the US that China built over the last 10 years in China. Do you not agree that, I mean, their argument is that this will lead to production of these products in the US, which will eventually drive down prices because it will lead to a competitive industry in the US and also in China. Do you not think that that is a useful policy choice that they are trying to make? And over the long term, do you think that that will lead to cheaper prices for these goods globally? Thank you.
Well, I think that there are certainly areas, and you point to steel, where there is a supply-demand imbalance domestically that is being reflected in sending that supply out into foreign markets. I would argue that that is a symptom of a bigger problem in China, and that is letting too much of the industrial sector now being supported and driven by state-owned enterprises that are less susceptible to market pressures that might otherwise promote a more rational balance between supply and demand. And I think the emphasis on SOE-led industrial activity does create inefficiencies with important global repercussions, and that just underscores the need for intensified efforts at SOE reforms that over time I think would begin to alleviate that type of problem. The rationale that you describe for putting up barriers to protect nascent green energy production in the developed world, I reject that completely. I think, if anything, it will make the competitive pressures less intense, as protectionism always does. And I think the cost differential, US, China, EU, China, on EVs, batteries, even solar panels, is so wide that protectionism, all that will do, I think, will again keep the global price level higher than would otherwise be the case. So I think this is a tax on precisely the types of products that a world afflicted with climate change needs more than ever, and I would not be in favor of that or support that type of rationale to just, quote, give us time to catch up.
Thank you. Okay, we have the lady in the front. Yes.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm a journalist from China Internet Information Center. And the first question, you have just stressed the importance of total factor productivity. You said that China cannot achieve the high quality growth with a weak total total factor productivity. So what are the suggestions for Chinese government to improve total factor productivity? And the second question, how would you evaluate the trade relation between China and the U.S.? How would you evaluate the impact of the U.S. election on China-U.S. trade relations? Thank you.
TFP policies, again, there's a long debate of this in the economic and policy literature, and investing in human capital, innovation, all part of the agenda, and these are areas where I think China is in very good shape to boost TFP. My theme that I have underscored several times today is to shift the mix of economic support away from low productivity SOEs to higher productivity private sector, especially technology companies. Without doing that, many of the other things that are being achieved so successfully in China will just get lost in the equation. That would be my single most important objective. In terms of the election, what we've seen from President Biden, as I indicated in my presentation, has been a surprising and disappointing continuation of the protectionist approach that was sparked by President Trump. And I don't see any signs that President Biden is going to rethink this approach should he be reelected at the end of this year. And former President Trump, who the last I checked is still running, even though he might be behind jail bars in November, is in favor of massive further increases of tariffs on Chinese products. And so I don't think we can count on him for delivering spontaneous relief on the U.S.-China trade front either.
Okay, good. Maybe last round. I don't know if China Daily or Beijing Daily was here. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm a business reporter from China Daily. I got two questions. My first question is, China has made progress in containing the risk of a debt deflation loop and increasing efforts to support housing inventory digestion. So how do you see those moves to stabilize the economy, and what efforts are needed to do more to bolster China's economic recovery or tackle some structural issues? And my second question is, actually, recently, China's top leadership has addressed the importance of deepening economic structural reforms, and the third plenary will be held in July with a key focus on reforms. So what will be the key policy focus for China to deepen economic reforms? Thank you.
What was the first one?
第一个问题是什么？你刚才说的第一个问题。
The first one?
Dealing with some structural issues like the property sector and
Okay,
what else should we do?
sorry. Yeah, the recent initiatives, I think, are steps in the right direction, but only steps. The property sector package is, I think, has the right focus aimed at absorbing the inventory overhang of unsold housing units but the funding support, as announced by the People's Bank of China, is too small. If there's a lesson that we've learned from earlier housing property crises, whether they're Japan or the United States, is you need what we call a big bazooka. That means a big gun, a large package, err on the side of doing too much, not too little. This package is too little. It's incremental. It absorbs only a small portion of the overhang. It's going in the right direction, but it needs far more funding support to really make a major dent in the overhang of unsold housing units. In terms of the upcoming third plenum, I think the government has been very explicit in emphasizing, whether it's President Xi or Premier Li, the efforts on new productive forces, new technologies, and President Xi has, in fact, even indicated in a signed article late last year that his metric of success would be TFP. So that's very clear. What's not clear, though, is the second issue, one that Henry and I have both addressed, and that is to really deepen and expand the emphasis on supporting consumer-led rebalancing in China. Henry has some proposals on hukou reform and transferring ownership of rural residents. That is very important, and I support them. I have made recommendations for years on the social safety net, health care, and retirement. I think policies need to be formulated more explicitly and more comprehensively to address the shortfall of domestic household consumption in China. Without the Chinese consumer, I think economic growth is going to remain a big question mark in the years ahead. And the third plenum is the time to address that. And I would hope that more progress will be made, in the upcoming reform agenda.